Hi everyone, I'm Evan Wilkerson, and today I'm interviewing Robert Velarde. He's a Christian apologist and philosopher and an author, and he also happens to be working here at World Challenge as our managing editor. So, Robert, thanks so much for taking the time to let me interview you.
Sure, it's great to be here, Evan.
Yeah, so I wanted to just open up and ask you a question about your personal life. As I mentioned, you're an author, and so I'm just curious, what was your most enjoyable book writing? What was the book that you had most fun writing?
Sure, that would be an easy one. I think that was a book I wrote called The Wisdom of Pixar. Of course, about Pixar animation studios and their movies. So movies like Finding Nemo and Up and The Incredibles and Monsters, Inc., things like that. So I wrote a book about that, talking about ethics and virtue and right and wrong, based on those films. And it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing that. I was able to visit Pixar studios a couple of times and
Wow.
had a great experience with that project.
Wow, that's amazing that you got to watch movies as a part of your study for a book. And of course it's educational. It helps people learn about ethics.
Right.
That's
exactly.
amazing. How long did it take to write that book?
That was probably the fastest turn book that I did because I wanted it to come out around the time of Toy Story 3,
Oh, okay.
which I believe was 2011.
Okay.
2010 maybe. I'm trying to remember the years, but
Yeah.
my publisher, InterVarsity Press, said, you can take longer and do it later. And I said, no, it'll probably do better if we release with a major Toy Story film.
Yeah.
So
That's smart on the marketing advice.
so that book was completed in 6 months or less.
Okay.
Yeah.
You also wrote Conversations with C.S. Lewis. Is that the title?
Yes,
Yeah.
that was a lot of fun to write as well, but more complex, I'd say, because that one is written as a dialogue between C.S. Lewis and a skeptic. And there's a lot of history and places they travel to and different characters and a lot of different topics about Christianity and God and faith and all over the spectrum of Lewis's thought. And trying to be faithful to him and his ideas was the tricky part for that project.
Yeah, it's hard when researching and wanting to claim somebody's ideas or present somebody's ideas because you have to be very factual and not
Exactly.
get lazy about it.
Yeah,
So
I didn't
lots
want
of
to
study.
inject my own ideas in areas where maybe I differ from Lewis,
Yeah.
but I wanted to be faithful to what he had believed and wrote about.
Yeah, that's so good. Yeah, I mentioned C.S. Lewis, and I think the second lesson of this apologetics curriculum. So hopefully people watching are getting familiar with who C.S. Lewis is and his contribution to apologetics. So definitely pick up Robert's books and The Wisdom of Pixar and Conversations with C.S. Lewis. Today, I want to be talking about your testimony and your coming to faith, really, for this series of videos that we're doing in the curriculum. It's about evidence for God. And I thought you would be an amazing person to interview because you really struggled and wrestled with what evidence is there for God. So I was wondering, just to start, could I ask you about your beginning stages of belief or lack of belief? Like, as a child, did you believe in God?
Well, that's a good question as well, and I would sort of preface that by saying that I grew up in the 70s, right? We're
Okay.
talking
Yeah.
formative years were 1970s, and this is an era that's coming out of Vietnam War, coming out of the Richard Nixon Watergate scandal, a lot of turmoil in the Middle East, which of course we still have. And it's sort of this post-60s, everything's going to be great, there's going to be peace and love and joy, and then it didn't work, right? So we end up here in the 70s with a lot of disillusionment, I think, things not happening the way that people quite thought it would. And that's sort of the environment that I grew up in, and not really having a grounded worldview of any kind. So by worldview, I would say that that's how someone sees the world and makes sense of it and interprets it. Christianity is a worldview. Atheism is a worldview. Any of these major belief systems. And I didn't have that. I didn't have a grounding. Was not in a church-going family, so my Sundays were sleep in and watch TV, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't, we're going to go to church or learn about God.
Sure.
So it was, I would say, a nominal a sense that there existed some sort of God creature, sort of a caricature, the grandfatherly figure, with the long white beard,
Sure.
telling you what to do and what not to do. So that was sort of my childhood experience of God. And, that shifted a lot more into skepticism when I got to high school.
Okay, into skepticism. And what kind of spurred on that skepticism? What made it something that you were like, I'm going to be a skeptic if it was like that?
Yeah, and it's, again, a different era. This was pre-internet, pre-Wi-Fi. Nobody had cell phones. You really got your information in person from other people or from literature, from books. And I got most of these ideas from books I would read at the time in high school. I did a lot of reading of material that wasn't assigned to me in high school. I just did reading I wanted to read on my own.
You like to read.
Yeah, so I would read a lot of the existentialist writers, Camus, Sartre, some of that, even some of the what you might call dark comedy, Kurt Vonnegut kind of material.
Sure.
That really viewed the universe as not having a God, or if there was a God, God was not active and doing anything in the world. He sort of wound up the clock of the universe and just let it go. So that's kind of what I drifted into, the sort of, there's not really a point to anything, but we're going to live anyway and may as well have some fun while you're doing it.
Looking back now, did you think that you really believed those were convincing arguments, or was it more like you could see it was just your heart and you were going wherever your heart told you to?
Sure. I think it reminds me of Josh McDowell, famous apologist who wrote the books Evidence That Demands a Verdict and many others. And he said that there are usually three reasons why people don't accept Christianity. It's pride and ignorance and moral problems. And I would say I had all three. So, I had a certain amount of pride.
Perfect storm.
Ignorance of not really knowing much about Christianity or Christ or the evidence or arguments for it. And moral issues, and that I wanted to do what I wanted to do without something else telling me. So in some ways I would think, at least in my case, I gravitated toward that existentialist or nihilistic kind of thought as an excuse to let me do what I wanted to do.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So where did you start to kind of turn a corner? Because obviously now you're a Christian. So what were the beginning steps of change in your life?
Right. Yeah, good question. And I think it began with my studies as a musician. I started studying music composition was my major in college.
Okay.
And everyone had to have an instrument, so my instrument was piano. A lot of practicing, a lot of work. People think, oh, you're doing a music degree, that sounds easy. But 4 hours a day of practicing, and that was for a non-performance major. If you were a performance major, you were expected to practice twice that a day. So you got 7-8 hours of practicing if you were in that field. And, just I think encountering that musical field, I think led me to start thinking, is there something more? Because a lot of the music we studied, even at a secular university, is sacred music. It's Christian music. It's the masters of composition were all Christian composers. And that's something that, lasted up until probably the 17th, 18th century. And, nowadays we don't think of it as much. We have Christian pop music. But that back then, what we studied was people like J.S. Bach, very committed Christian man who, wrote some amazing music. So that, I think, initially started me thinking, well, why are these people writing this Christian music? Don't they know it's not true, that there
Mm-hmm.
is no God? And
Mm-hmm.
um, from there, I would say people influenced me. Again, I said it was mostly in-person people that I knew and literature.
Yeah. Okay.
Uh, the fact that someone gave me a copy of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis was probably the biggest
Mm-hmm.
intellectual influence that made me start thinking more about, well, does God exist and how can we know that? And I was not at the place where someone could present the gospel to me and I would just respond.
Sure.
There was too many questions that I had that needed to be answered before I was ready for that. So if I came across the Bible tract at a restaurant or something that said, God loves you and has a plan for your life, I'm thinking, well, I don't even know if God exists.
Right.
And I don't even know if he's capable of love. And I don't know if he's involved in my life or the world anymore. So I needed to start much earlier in my studies as far as does God exist? So that was the question I wanted answered.
Awesome. So music helped, people helped. Were there any other arguments that helped you see that the evidence for God is viable and true?
Definitely. And, in my studies in seminary, what I learned and studied had to involve what we called a cumulative case.
Okay.
So you build a case for Christianity. You look at what the best explanation is of something. What's the best explanation of reality? And that's sort of the approach that I take. And I can't point to any single argument that's the one that's going to convert someone, right? And I think
Sure.
everyone's different too. So it's a combination of factors.
Mm-hmm.
For me, there was the argument from the universe, there's the argument from design, there's the argument from morality. And, these are all what I'd call, or what theologians call, general revelation. So general revelation would be, what can we understand about God from nature or from human nature? And this is something we see in passages like Psalm 19, right? The heavens declare the glory of God. Or Romans 1:20, for since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen,
Right.
being understood from what has been made. So we look at things like that, the evidence of the universe. In Romans 2:15, we have the law is written on our hearts. Things like that, I think, argue for general revelation. John Calvin would say that we each have this sense of the divine. He called it in Latin the sensus divinitatis, that we know there's something there. We know that we have innately the sense that there is a God or something bigger and greater than us. And to try to sort that out, the arguments that helped me the most were design. For example, the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony didn't appear out of thin air from nothing.
Right.
It
Right.
had an intelligent designer behind it. How much more complex is something like the universe or the human eye or the fingers I would use to play a complicated piece of music? Or if you look at a score of an orchestra and you say, look at all the little black dots, right? But it's all very organized and complicated and put together in a way that required a designer. So from there, we get the argument from design. Then I would say morality, what is right and what is wrong. If I had a sense that there was evil in the world or wrong in the world, where did I get that sense? C.S. Lewis said, a man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has an idea of a straight line. So the straight line is, well, if there's objective moral law, there must be an objective moral lawgiver. So that source points back to God. So those arguments were, very moving to me. And of course, that doesn't get you all the way, right? That gets you to belief that there is something. There's some sort of God who exists, but what kind of God is that? So we're not even quite at Christianity yet.
Yeah, that's really good. One of the things I'm trying to explain in the apologetics curriculum is this evidence is really good for helping somebody who's not even willing to hear about Christianity yet, but they might be willing to listen to evidence for God. So that's fascinating. I love how you saw music and the beauty of music as intelligent design, evidence of intelligent design. So, okay, so you're in college now, and you're listening to music, and you're starting to get evidence for God's existence that seems pretty compelling or pretty convincing to you. So, last couple questions. What was that thing that helped you finally become a Christian? What was the conversion point from theism to Christianity?
Sure. And, prior to that, I kind of had a diversion into pantheism,
Okay.
where everything is viewed as God. And I liked that because it gave me a sense of some sort of supernatural thing occurring, but it didn't really demand anything of my life.
Sure.
It was easy in a way. But what pointed me, I think, more toward Christianity was probably reading the Bible itself. And I didn't have a Bible, we didn't have a Bible in my home. So one day I went to, like I said, a bookstore. We couldn't Google this, right? You had to go out and buy a book. I didn't even know what translation to buy. So I went to a bookstore. I bought a copy of the Bible. It was a New King James Version, which is, your grandfather's favorite translation back in the day.
Yeah, sure.
So fortunately, I got a good one and not a bad translation.
Absolutely.
And I still have that Bible, and I have a lot of notes in it in the Old Testament, basically myself criticizing the Bible and taking it apart.
Yeah.
But what I think moved me in the direction of Christ was starting to read the Gospels. And that was, for me, a great place to start because we have obviously these accounts of the person of Christ. And at the time, I would say I didn't even, wouldn't even know if he existed or not. There was a lot in culture, back in that time. Even today still, there's some factions that would say, well, he is just a myth or a legend or he existed, but everything's been exaggerated and it's taken, so many years to write his story down. Of course, that's not true. We have some of the Gospels. I think Mark was one of the earliest that was written that was, within the lifetime of people who were alive when Christ was ministering. So it's not something that took hundreds of years to develop. So realizing that Christ was an actual historical figure, reading firsthand his claims and demands that he would make on your life, that was very powerful and moving. And it was really to the point where, I was cornered, I would say. I didn't want it to be true because I would have preferred to continue to be my own God, in a sense, and make my own moral choices. But, I got to the point where it was you could deny or defy the evidence, or I could follow and submit to Christ. And for someone involved in music as I was, it was my whole life. There was a lot of pride and arrogance there. To get to the point of submission to Christ was very difficult. But I did it, and, it changed my life literally. And now looking back, more than 3 decades later, I've been working for Christian organizations for more than 30 years. And it's the one constant that corresponds with what's true, with what's reality.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I love your type of testimony that it shows that God was really using evidence and reason and logic to bring you to the place where it became illogical not to believe. And it reminds me of C.S. Lewis's conversion, where he talks about, I must have been, the most reluctant convert.
Exactly.
I came into the kingdom of God kicking and screaming. Like,
Sure.
God just brought him in because the evidence was so compelling. And,
Right.
and I see that's why apologetics is so valuable.
And in retrospect, I see, having now studied religion and philosophy and from a Christian perspective, I can look back and say, well, biblically we see the pattern, and we see that there's not anything in the New Testament that says we're to believe just out of blind faith, right? I think of Acts 26, I think it is, where Paul is dialoguing with the Roman leaders, the Roman authorities, and he's giving his testimony. He has an opportunity to share with a king, what he has gone through. And Paul shares not only his own experience that he had, having a vision of Christ, but he says, he points to the resurrection as evidence that this was not done in a corner, he says. And then, the people he's interacting with say, your great learning has driven you insane, right? They're calling Paul crazy.
Yeah.
Paul is a very educated, intelligent man. And he says, I am not insane. And what I am saying is true and reasonable. And that's my foundation for believing, not because Christianity makes me feel good every day, because it doesn't, but because it is true and reasonable, like Paul said.
That's wonderful, because we're starting to establish a very solid foundation for our faith. So in the bad days, the good days, good experiences, bad experiences, it's okay, because we stand on a firm foundation, and you and I know that the Word of God is eternal and will never pass away. That's a firm foundation. And then there's all these extra biblical evidences that help build that cumulative case.
Exactly. And then that's the other side of what I mentioned earlier about general revelation. We have what theologians call special revelation, and that is we can only get so far by looking at nature and creation and design and morality. To get to the full level of God's truth, we have God's Word, we have the Bible, and we have Christ, who came and dwelt among us, John 1, who is sort of the ultimate in special revelation, is the incarnation, God in human form coming to us to rescue us, to give us some hope.
And making claims like, before Abraham was, I am,
Right.
claiming the divine name. So radical claims and radical experiences like the resurrection.
Right. And that passage in John 8, I think it is an exact quote of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where, God says, I am, ego eimi in the Greek. He's saying, I am the eternal God. And, the people of his day knew that, because not many verses later, they're picking up stones to stone him for blasphemy. For you, being a mere man, claim to be God.
They didn't mistake what he was saying. They knew exactly what he was getting at.
Yeah, we look at it in our day and we say, oh, Jesus never claimed to be God. But the things he did and the way he did them, it was very clear to people of his day that he was making claims to be equal with God and to be God. Who when he forgives sins, they ask him, who can forgive sins but God alone? And he's like, well, yeah.
And so between general revelation and special revelation, you have this very powerful cumulative case for there is a God, and there is the second person of the Trinity, and his name's Jesus Christ, and by him we are saved. And that's what we're learning in this apologetics curriculum, how to grow our own faith and how to help others come to the faith. And so, Robert, I just wanted to know if, as we close out here, is there any advice that you could give somebody who's just stepping in to apologetics? Maybe some of the terms sound confusing. What would you say to that young believer who's excited but also challenged by apologetics?
Sure, and we live in a day where it can be daunting. There's so many apologetics resources. There's so many arguments for Christianity, arguments against Christianity, trying to make sense of that. I would say to just begin simple. Begin with the basics of what are the foundations of our faith. And I think, too, before we can begin to defend Christianity, we need to know what it is. We need to know what the gospel is, what's important, what is the foundation of Christianity that we've held to for more than 2,000 years. And once we have that, then I think you begin to look at, I would say, even the classics of apologetics, Mere Christianity, that was originally a series of radio talks, which is why even today it comes across as so conversational and down to earth.
Yeah, I love Mere Christianity. That's going to be a yearly read for me. And I hope that you guys pick up Robert's books, Robert Velarde's books, and pick up Mere Christianity. Robert, thanks so much for the discussion today. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, everyone, for this time on this episode. We look forward to the next series of topics in Ready to Answer Apologetics curriculum. Thanks, and God bless.